I'd like to invite you all to watch this video. I'd like to invite you all to watch this video. I'd like to invite you all to watch this video. I'd like to invite you all to watch this.
Miss, i-mute ang other Facebook Live stuff. Miss, i-mute ang other Facebook Live stuff.
I can't hear Marisa.
Yeah. Okay, maybe we can just proceed with the welcome remarks of Dr. Ramon Sevilla.
I can't hear Marisa.
Okay, maybe we can just proceed with the welcome remarks of Dr. Ramon Sevilla.
I can't hear Marisa.
Just proceed with the welcome remarks of Dr. Ramon Sevilla.
All sorts of feedback. There's a whole lot of feedback.
Welcome remarks of Dr. Ramon Sevilla.
All sorts of feedback. There's a whole...
Miss Marisa, please mute your Facebook Live if it's projecting so that we don't have feedback.
PJ? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. PJ? I'm canceling the Facebook Live for now because there seems to be a problem.
Yeah.
I'll just record this and show it in our Facebook Live. I'm canceling the Facebook Live for now because there seems to be a problem.
Nagihapon ang echo.
In our Facebook Live. I'm canceling the Facebook Live for now because there seems to be a problem.
I think your feedback comes from your speakers back to your microphone. Do you have a headset, Marisa?
Actually, Mon, I've already minimized the volume. Okay.
Okay, nawa naman ang kuan.
Okay.
Nawa na ang
This is now being recorded.
okay.
Mon, maybe proceed with your welcome remarks.
Okay. Good morning. I welcome you all to the Paglaom sa Cebu talk series, this time with Dr. Glenn Green as our speaker. There is a saying that economics is a dismal science. Although I am only tangentially familiar with the study of complex systems, it seems to me the science of collapse is even more dismal. Collapse spells disaster for which there might be no getting out of, except over a long period of time with many casualties and with great human suffering. Depending on your perspective, we are beginning to see the frightful mess that is unfolding in our world as a result of our development choices, right down to our cities and communities. It is for this reason that we should have a clear understanding of the risks and challenges in facing the economic, energy, and climate change crises. As an urban planner, my concern is that hopefully Dr. Green's presentation, while talking about macro global forces that influence and shape things at the local level, will help us reflect on our own urban situation sa Dakbayan sa Cebu. Are we aiding and abetting system collapse in our own neck of the woods with our unsustainable and limited growth mentality, as if we are in a hurry to collapse? Or is our social consciousness beginning to find alternatives to the prevailing way of life so that in our own urban practices, we may delay the onset of this crisis, even reverse it somehow?
Okay.
These are open questions that can only be answered when our consciousness leads us to a different set of collective actions instead of these dismal prospects. Good luck to all of us, and God save Cebu.
Amen. Anyway, again, welcome to our talk. So again, I'm BJ, the co-host, and will be the moderator for the Q&A or the open forum later. But for now, I'll be introducing our speaker for today. It's none other than Dr. Glenn Martin Green. So Dr. Green here is a retired full professor from the Environmental Science program at the Biology Department, School of Arts and Sciences of the University of San Carlos. He had dozens of publications, conference talks, articles, peer-reviewed papers, and book chapters under his belt. As a professor, he specializes being a remote sensing specialist and biogeographer. He designs and implements methodological protocols on remote sensing for various research analysis stages and develops an interactive internet website to disseminate these remote sensing techniques to students and the global change community. Topics covered include remote sensing theory, radiometric calibration, atmospheric correction, radiometric rectification, spectral mixture analysis, reflectance properties of vegetation, field sampling strategies, field methodologies appropriate for remote sensing, the limitations of NDVI, use of field spectrometers, and the use of hemispherical 35mm photography to measure LAI. He is currently working on a textbook tentatively titled Remote Sensing of Terrestrial Vegetation and Monitoring Exchange. As a professor, he also had various stints on various educational institutions, like from the Indiana University Center for the Study of Institutions, Population and Environmental Change, Boston University Department of Geography, Center for Remote Sensing and Analysis, the National Air and Space Museum, Center for Earth and Planetary Studies at the Smithsonian Institution, and the Department of Land, Air, and Water Resources at UC Davis, and the Department of Geology at Macalester College. Please welcome Dr. Glenn Martin Green. I will be sharing his slides also.
Oh, thank you, BJ, and thank you for Ramon and Marisa and Mara for making this whole talk possible. So what I'm going to try to do today is really very, I guess, pretty ambitious. Of all the talks I've made, this probably is the most ambitious. So because I try to put everything together that I've learned across my career. So as Ramon said, this talk is going to be about the potential and near-term collapse of Western civilization. And it stems from these three crises, the one in energy and economy. Those two I'm going to really talk about. And the environment is just too much for this talk. So I've kind of cut that out. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is kind of a short outline of my talk. So I'll just go through this very briefly. At the beginning, I'm going to talk about the three large eras of humanity. So this is the whole history of humanity in these three eras. And then in one of those eras, agriculture, civilization is invented, but it really has this one kind of fatal flaw in that all civilizations so far have disappeared. We only have the one that we're living in now. Of all the 80-some civilizations, only one exists now. And that's Western civilization. It took over the world. So I'm going to describe these what I call four phases of Western civilization as it takes over the world. Then I'm going to talk briefly about the nature of Western civilization and how its mode of how it has done what it's done. Then I'm going to briefly describe neoliberal economics and how it dominated first the US and then the rest of the world. Then I'm going to talk about the importance of energy and what peak oil is. Then I'm going to talk about overshoot and collapse and the limits to gross study. Then I'm going to talk about resource use and the peak oil theory. And then in the end, I'm going to talk about Ponzi economics. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this condenses down the three major human eras, right? They're hunter-gatherers, which we were for about 96% of human history. We were hunter-gatherers. So probably we knew how to do that. From about 250,000 years ago, when humans kind of as a species first existed, to just 10,000 years ago, we were mostly hunter-gatherers. There still are some hunter-gatherers around. And then 10,000 years ago, most of us switched to agriculture after the agricultural revolution. And this led to the creation of what we know as civilization. About 4% of human history is we're agriculturalists. And then the last era is the fossil fuel users. About 250 years ago, we had the Industrial Revolution. So this is really only 0.1% of human history we're dealing with fossil fuels. So probably we're not so good at this. Next, please. Okay, so this shows the first ones. I like this slide because the hunter-gatherers are white. From 250,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago, we were doing hunter-gathering. So this is basically the mode that all animals use, where they just gather up what God has provided. Next, please. And then the agricultural revolution, which occurred in multiple sites about 10,000 years ago, most humans switched to agricultural technologies like the Malay, paddy rice, and carabao you see in this picture. The Philippines is actually at an advantage that maybe about 40% or around 40% are still agriculturalists. So most people think maybe this is a disadvantage that Philippines lags behind, but actually this is a big, big advantage going forward. Next, please. Okay, there's many of these, but I'm going to talk about just one of the biggest collapses of these early civilizations. Rome was the largest city in the classical world. At one point, it had a population of about 1 million people. But the last emperor was deposed in 476 AD, and just a few decades later, Rome had a population of only 10 to 20,000. So you can see this is what collapse really looks like. The abandonment of urban centers and movement toward the agricultural zones. Now this anthropologist, Joseph Tainter, he's studied many of these early civilizations, and he's kind of come up with a theory of why they collapsed. Rome collapsed from the invasions, crop failures, disease, environmental degradation, but those are the apparent causes, according to Tainter, of their collapse. But the ultimate cause is this diminishing returns on social complexity. More or less, Tainter's thesis is that civilization gets more and more complex in order to solve its problems, but that complexity demands more and more energy. And then as you go, the more and more complexity you add to your civilization, the kind of diminishing returns you get on adding more and more complexity, right? So you kind of end up in this bind, which you just can't get out of, and civilization collapses. Next, please. Okay, so this is my kind of condensation of Western history into these four phases. And you'll be familiar with a lot of this. There's these four phases, 1, 2, 3, 4. Each one is centered around a different set of countries. Each phase, each of these kind of major countries has different modes of operation. There's different levels of global cooperation within each of these phases. They have different energy sources. They cover different spans of time that they've existed, and there's different reasons why they kind of come to an end. And so I'll try to go over this very briefly. But there at the bottom is one of the kind of the major things I realized from looking at this analysis, doing this. I never saw this in any historian before, but in the last 500 years, this is mostly all Western civilization. We have these four phases, and interestingly, the time span of each of the phases kind of is half of what the previous one was. So to me, this doesn't look good from just the basic phases. Okay, next, please. Okay, I'm going to start with the first phase. This is Portugal and Spain, and Filipinos will be familiar with most of this, I guess. It has a time span of about 300 years, and the major part of it. Its energy source is basically solar energy, renewable, basically powered by agriculture, wind and timber, are used for their sailing technology. And they had the advantage that they had a lot of sailing technology and they had a lot of war experience. At the time, at the beginning of this phase, the world was divided into these two halves by this Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, where the world was divided in these two hemispheres. One, the Spanish could plunder, and the other one, the Portuguese could plunder. And that they did, right? And I'll explain that a little bit more. They established these mostly sugar plantations. The Spanish wiped out the Aztec and Inca civilizations, and they amassed this huge kind of one-time bounty of gold, right? And also from the Philippines. But Spain lost most of its colonies to independence revolutions, really in the 19th century, mostly. Many led by this Simon Bolivar in South America. But because they were just depending on this gold that they got from previous civilizations, they were basically bankrupt by the time of the Philippine independence movement. And in 1898, the Americans, a kind of an upstart nation, were able to defeat the Spanish Empire in the Spanish-American War very easily and take over the Philippines and other colonies of Spain. Next, please. Okay, now going to the other hemisphere. Portugal exploited most of the other hemisphere, and that's most of Africa and Asia. But what they mostly did, what benefited them the most, was they seized control of the trade between the two biggest economies at the time, and those were China and India, right? Europe was really a distant third in terms of the economy of the day. So they took over the trade and they taxed it. And how they did this was they captured the port city of Malacca, which is now in Malaysia. They captured this city in 1511 with the help of one of their soldiers. Well, they had many soldiers, but one of them was Magellan, who we all know about here, right? And they took this, who ran this trading network between China and India before the Portuguese? Well, that was the Malays, right? Of which Humabon and all the Cebuanos, they were all a part of this trading network. So they removed the Malays and put themselves in charge and profited from the trade between these two large economies. Next. Okay, the interesting thing about this phase is that Spain and Portugal, they didn't fight any wars directly, but they didn't like each other, right? And they didn't cooperate with each other. So we would characterize this now, I think, as kind of an early Cold War, not fighting, but not cooperating. So we didn't really have a period of what we now know as globalization, right? We had galleon trade, but that was just within the Spanish hemisphere, and the Portuguese had their own trade, but they didn't cooperate globally. So there was no real globalization. Next, please. Okay, the second phase, was by Britain and France mostly. And they started out solar, like the Spanish and Portuguese, but then around 1750, they converted to coal powered. So they started the Industrial Revolution with coal and started using fossil fuels. So, But during the first half of this phase, Britain and France, who was the other major power, other major nation in this phase, were fighting multiple wars with each other, right? And of course, that eliminated any chance of globalization during this first part of this phase. But after the French really lost very badly with Bonaparte in the Battle of Waterloo, the French kind of gave up and they said, "Oh, you can be in charge of this global development." So Britain kind of turned out to be the one global hegemon. And at that point, you got globalization. Next, please. Okay, so this is the start of the Industrial Revolution. It's the first major invention of the Industrial Revolution, which you can see there at the top, that machine there, in 1712 by this guy, Thomas Newcomen. This engine was really just a water pump, pumped water out from coal mines. And this was important because it used the coal that they were mining to power the engine. So this was a real critical positive feedback in starting the Industrial Revolution. And that's what really led to the supremacy of England, because it had the most coal reserves of all the countries in Europe. And so the Industrial Revolution spread in Europe and spread to the USA and Japan, among others. Next. Okay, so France kind of accepted that Great Britain would dominate, and that we had this kind of first part of globalization, the first kind of a period of globalization, which we call the Gilded Age now. It was a relatively short period between 1870 and 1913, right? The golden age of globalization. They had relative peace, free trade, financial and economic stability. But the problem was Britain's coal production peaks, right, in 1913, and this brings on its decline. So its major fuel source was coal, and that was finite, and then it peaked, which I'll explain later, peaking process, and then globalization ended with World War I. And then Britain's dominance kind of gradually deteriorated through the Great Depression, the 1930s, and World War II. Next. Okay, now we'll talk about phase 3. This phase is dominated by the US and the USSR, right? This phase was relatively short, much half the length of the previous one. The previous one I didn't mention was 150 years. And this phase, the energy source is oil. We should mention that World War II was fought over oil, basically. The US and the Soviet Union were strong allies in World War II, but then they turned on each other once they had defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Right? And these two world wars and the Great Depression kind of eliminated England and France from dominance. The dominance of US and USSR, Soviet Union, is not really surprising, because those two countries, along with Saudi Arabia, are the three biggest oil producing nations in history. Those three, the US, the USSR, and Saudi Arabia. So it's kind of not surprising that that US and USSR kind of dominated this phase. And I'll talk about this more later, but here, go back, please. they had these three oil crises, which I'll explain more later. But briefly, the first one hit the US in 1970 when its oil production peaked. But basically, it kind of took over production, or it used production from Saudi Arabia after 1980 or so. So it kind of co-opted one of the top three oil producer nations, that's Saudi Arabia. Next, please. One of the characteristics of this phase is that these were dueling superpower alliances in the US and the Soviet Union. They had thousands of nuclear weapons, massive fleets of ships, planes, missiles. They had a lot of covert political control. They staged multiple coups and supported dictators, of which we know about here in the Philippines. They avoided World War III, meaning that they never fought each other directly, but they fought each other in other people's countries, which I guess was probably their idea. In Korea, Vietnam are two obvious examples. So the greatest toll of their conflict was really borne by the Asians, not the Americans or the Soviets. Next, please. Okay, now you can look on this chart up here on the left. It tracks the oil production of the Soviet Union and some client states. And you'll notice that the Soviet Union's oil production peaks in 1987. And that's kind of a critical year, it turns out, because their oil production starts going down, and then Eastern Europe breaks off with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and then you have a political collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and then a subsequent economic collapse where their military, their academia, their medical sectors all kind of collapse. And so they had a really bad time of it for a while at least. Next, please. Okay, so in this final phase, phase 4, there's only one superpower left, and that's the USA. Their energy source is oil. They've lasted about 30 years. So we would expect, given the history of the previous phases, we would expect them to kind of come to some kind of peak around and collapse around now. They invented resurrected really this new form of capitalism, neoliberalism. It's really like the Britain's form of capitalism, proliferated, where corporations were freed of government regulation. They could basically do whatever they want, and they were given the rights of citizens. The US adopted this trickle-down economics where wealth increasingly flowed to the wealthiest. Businesses were free to offshore their jobs to other countries. Of course, that benefited those other countries, but impoverished more and more Americans. US jobs initially flowed to Mexico after NAFTA, but then both of those countries lost jobs to China. And I guess maybe that is reversing at this point. Businesses relocated their production out of the US and other countries into countries with low labor costs and the least environmental regulation. So this led to the second period of globalization. Next. Okay, so we had relative peace and under the hegemony of the US, in the second period of globalization. But the wealth in the US became increasingly concentrated in the richest 1%, and its democracy edged toward oligarchy. In fact, the US basically is categorized as an oligarchy by political scientists. Most nations of the world adopted these same neoliberal capitalist policies, and global economic growth shifted mainly to the so-called BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, the main one, South Africa. We had increasing economic inequality, such that the dozen richest individuals in the world, most of them are Americans, have more wealth than the poorest half of humanity, right? The richest 1% in the world have 82% of all the wealth that's been generated. Next. Okay, now we've been in 30 years of this phase so far, but we've already seen these early signs of the destabilizing of this phase 4. We had this Great Recession, so-called Great Recession in 2008, 2009, also called the global financial crisis, right? It's the worst global economic recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. It started, really, it was caused by these two simultaneous things that happened. The third oil crisis, which I'll explain a little bit more later, and the simultaneous collapse of these speculative real estate bubbles in both the US and in Europe, right? There was two previous oil crises in the 1970s, but those were caused by war in the Middle East, which affected the supply of oil coming out of the Middle East. But this third oil crisis, there wasn't any conflict in the Middle East. So it's kind of caused by a different thing, and that's by the peaking of oil production, which I'll explain much more later. We also have China's coal production also peaking in 2013, right? And we have economic growth slowing in the US, Europe, UK, Japan. We have high debt among all those nations, which I'll explain more later. Next, please. Okay, now these are more recent signs of the destabilizing of phase 4. In 2019, the US and China entered into this under Trump and Xi, this trade war and a tech war and a new Cold War. So they're really basically, I think, now in a Cold War situation, like the US and the Soviets. An example of that is Huawei's 5G chip, which perceived, I think rightly, by the US as a security threat. So, and it would be in all these thousands of Chinese consumer goods, so they couldn't really allow that. So they stopped Huawei, and Huawei, I guess, is probably gonna go bankrupt at this point, looks like. And this Nouriel Roubini has this nice quote here: as trade in goods, services, capital, labor, information, data, and technology becomes increasingly balkanized, meaning divided up, global production costs will rise, right? Which they have, and disrupt global supply chains, which is what we're seeing right now. A process that Roubini calls deglobalization, which I think we're in the middle of. We also have this global pandemic, which starts in China from what I think evidence suggests was from a lab leak, right? In China, Wuhan, in 2019. We also have these global warming threats, which are growing. I'm not going to talk about that, but that deserves its whole new talk by somebody. We have this US-China war threat over Taiwan. And all the countries of the world now have to choose which side they're going to be on. Next. So all of these things are destabilizing phase 4. Next, please. Okay, now go back one slide, please. Okay, so we can see, hopefully you can see from this last, my last slides that Western civilization is kind of unsustainable. There's increasing inequality, a slowing global economy, and the exponential decline in the time span of each succeeding phase from 300 to 150 to 60 to 30 years. These are really worrisome trends, and they suggest that Western civilization in general in phase 4, which is currently destabilizing in particular, are fundamentally unsustainable. And I think the fault lies, somebody is moving around a lot and creating a lot of noise. So turn off your mic if you could. The fault lies in Western civilization's tendency to exploit both human and natural environment for the sake of profit. Plus, how wealth has a tendency to continually concentrate, allowing it to corrupt national governments and diminish democracy, right? The needs of the exploited and the poor are increasingly neglected, and the natural environment that really sustains us all is continually degraded. And then these last two things I'm going to explain here in just a bit. One is this systems analysis modeling shows that systems like this, phase 1 through 3, have demonstrated already, they're kind of doomed to what we call overshoot and collapse, which I'll explain. And then Western civilization's current reliance on neoliberal capitalism, it's really, I'll explain this more, it's really, you can liken this to a gigantic Ponzi scheme, which I'll explain. It focuses on short-term thinking that benefits really just the rich and now endangers humanity's very survival. Next, please. Okay, now I'm going to explain how we ended up with this systems analysis. It really comes from the biological kind of experience of American biologists starting at the kind of the beginning of last century. In 1906, the Americans created this Grand Canyon National Game Reserve, which is just north of the Grand Canyon in what they call the Kaibab Forest. Excuse me. In this Kaibab Forest, there's these mule deer, which you see this picture of here. Well, to maximize the number of deer, which they wanted for the game reserve, and they really didn't know what they were doing at the time, obviously, as we'll see later, they killed off almost all the predators in that forest, right? The wolves, the coyotes, the cougars, the bobcats were all wiped out, right? And then the population of these deer started growing exponentially, right? There wasn't any predators to kind of keep their numbers in balance. So their population of the deer grew, and from 4,000 in 1906 to 100,000 in 1924. And the managers really thought this was great. But the problem is that these high deer population overgrazed this Kaibab forest, which you see a little picture of here. Next. So this is a nice chart. It's from a textbook that I have from the 1950s, which was the first mention I've ever been able to find of this. And really this analysis here, you can see very nicely explained in this video I just posted on PSS site about this Donella Meadows, who I'll explain who that is in just a bit. But the biologists in the United States, they kind of tried to figure out what went wrong in this game reserve kind of collapsed. And they created this concept of this carrying capacity of the reserve. And that means that the grass and vegetation that feed the deer. The expanded population of the deer exceeded the reserve's carrying capacity. Then the deer, most of the deer starved to death, and their population crashed down to 10,000 in 1939, and then they established kind of a new balance, of course, without predators at this point, but in much worse shape than they were before, because before this collapse, the deer had no problem. The grass and vegetation supply wasn't at all limited. They were limited really by the predator, their predators, as I guess God designed. Next. Okay, and then biologists kind of came up with this simple model of what really happened there. And this diagram shows that. We have the population of the deer or any kind of population in red. It grows over time if there's no limits on its growth. It passes the carrying capacity. It's in a period of overshoot. This overshoot period degrades the carrying capacity of their environment, and then their population crashes. And I guess it was this analysis from biologists that really led to the creation of this science we now call systems analysis, and that was used most effectively, I think, in the 1970s in this limits to growth study, which I'll talk about just ahead. Next, please. Okay, so this book and study, Limits to Growth, was published in 1972, but this research took place in the late 1960s, early 1970s. They developed this dynamic model of the entire world using computers for the first time. This kind of computer genius Forrester in MIT, he kind of invented this, wrote all the, go back please. He in MIT, this computer specialist invented all this, and it was used for the very first time. These limits to growth researchers, who this Donella Meadows and her husband, Dennis Meadows, were the lead authors. They developed a series of scenarios, right? They're really not predictions because you don't know what governments, other people are going to do in the future. So they developed a series of different scenarios to kind of show what was possible. And what they noticed was that in many of their runs, kind of the same thing happens. And that's talked about in the so-called standard run, which they called it the standard run. But basically, this is the business as usual scenario. So just keep doing what you're doing. In this particular scenario, the production and the food, industrial output and food production peak around the year 2020 and then collapse, and then the population of the globe starts to collapse, fall precipitously after 2030. And so at one point you're losing about 1 billion people every decade. Here, don't go forward until I tell you to. So go back, please. What they noticed also was that huge advances in technology don't really change this because we're dealing with exponential growth. So even if you have huge advances in technology, it doesn't really change the outcome of this collapse. Next, please. Okay, how could you avoid this collapse? Well, they found that that you could avoid it, this collapse, by doing a few things. One was that they're reducing the dependence on non-renewable resources, right? So the finite non-renewable resources are basically the fossil fuels. Or another thing you had to do was reduce the growth in industrial capital. You had to kind of self-limit the growth in industrial capital. And you had to reduce the growth of population. If you did all of those things, like in this model, if you implemented these in the 1970s, which is after they proposed this, you could stabilize the whole globe and civilization wouldn't collapse, right? If you instituted these three, and I would say many people were talking about doing this in the 1970s, right? Only in this manner could you achieve system stability, right? Well, that's what their modeling shows. Next, please. Well, how are we doing? Well, this Australian researcher, Graham Turner, in the early 2000s, he published a series of papers where he reanalyzed the limits to growth study. And he produced these graphs here, which show that we're really tracking the standard run or the business as usual, right? We're not tracking the so-called stabilized world scenario, right? So this doesn't look good because we're actually going down the collapse scenario model. Next. And then these graphs are really very indicative. He published, Graham Turner published these in 2014. Here, that kind of dashed line is kind of where we're at now. Resources are heading down to 50%. Industrial output, food and services are just before the collapse, and the birth rate, in fact, the death rate has already started to go up again globally, and in the United States in particular, it's actually going up now. So we're really kind of right before the system collapses, or the global civilization collapses. Now, next, please. Okay, now I want to explain a little bit more about how resources, or specifically finite resources, work, because people really don't understand this, I don't think, at all. And maybe that's understandable, because the fossil fuel companies don't want anyone to understand this. They don't want people to understand this, and so no one understands this. Fossil fuels are finite, and they're finite resources. Most people think resources are like draining a tank of gas or a tank of LPG. You only start to worry really when you're down at the end, right? Well, that's the way even here in our family, we use LPG. We only worry when we run out of LPG and then we have to go get another tank, right? Most people think of it that way. So how much have we used? What percent remains, right? And the perception is to only worry when you have a little bit left, right? But even the oil pessimists think we have about 50% left. And that's true. We have about 50% of all the oil that we started with. We still have 50% of it left now. So how can that be bad? Well, it turns out that that the amount of resources remaining is not the important thing. The important thing is on the next slide. So go to this next slide, please. And this was first shown by this oil analyst from Shell oil company, this M. King Hubbert in 1956, which was 2 years before I was born. He showed that the important thing is not how much resource remained or oil remains in the ground, but the production rate of the oil, which is really, it's easy to get that production rate because it's just the first derivative of the amount remaining, right? It's this red curve, right? And it has this peak. So that peak shows you that at the beginning of when you're using a resource, you're not using much because you just started using it. And at the end, you're not using much because you kind of quit using it. But in the middle, you're using it a lot, right? And you've developed a lot of technologies that use it and to produce it. So it peaks out in the middle, right? At about 50%. So that's when you run into trouble. If you look at that red curve, you'll see that it goes through a series of changes. At the beginning, it's increasing exponentially, right? So these are the real good times where your production of oil would be increasing exponentially every year. And then you go into a period where it's increasing linearly. And this is still good. Every year it's going to go up and up and up. And then at the beginning, as you approach the peak, the rate of growth slows, right? It slows down. And then once you start going over the edge, it starts going down. Oh, this is really bad, right? So at the top, it starts getting bad, right? When you get close to the peak, the prices become high and volatile, which I'll explain more later. Next, please. Okay, now we'll look at, this is the actual oil production, which is those little black dots there from the United States. And like I said, in 1956, Hubbert predicted that in 14 years in the future, in 1970, US oil production would reach a peak. Well, it did reach a peak in that year, and then it declined after that. I graduated with a petroleum engineering degree in 1980. And so the oil production had been going down 10 years by 1980. Well, in 1979, I gave a talk about this very subject to my petroleum engineering class, and nobody believed me that the oil production would go down and stay going down. Nobody believed me. The students didn't believe me. The professor didn't believe me, right? But it was true. It was true then, and it's even more true now. Next, please. Okay, so our world really is addicted to this oil. It's what we should call the master resource. It's critical for the global economy, especially the transportation sector. About 95% of all transportation fuels are oil derived, right? Without oil, globalization would be impossible, right? Cars, motorcycles, multi-cabs, trucks, jeepneys, ships, planes, all run on oil-derived fuels, right? We have a few vehicles that don't use oil, like, well, LPG taxis. Some taxis run on LPG, but that's also fossil fuel. Tricycads run on rice power, I guess, bikes also. Calesa run on grass. And we have a few electrics, but not much, right? The oil supplies the energy for economic growth. Next. Okay, this, another energy analyst, this Fairberg, this is a nice plot here because it shows the tight correlation between GDP and energy growth supply. So this is the growth of GDP versus, that's in blue, versus the growth of energy supplies. And you can see that they're just pretty closely correlate, right? And if we lose those energy supplies, there's this nice quote here at the bottom, which I'll just read. Changing to a situation of if we have a shrinking energy consumption per capita would likely be extraordinarily traumatic, right? Population would likely fall, commodity prices would drop to low levels, debt would tend to default, prices of shares of stock would fall, many governments would fail. So those are among the things that we're going to face in just a few years. Next, please. Okay, now this shows the oil price, right? This starts from the 1940s and goes up past the global financial crisis. So the red line is the price of oil. The gray bars are recessions. And you can see that economic recessions are kind of tied to when the oil prices jump up, right? You can see that pretty remarkably, at least lately. As I mentioned, the first two oil crises, the first one was in 1973, the second in 1979. Those were caused by conflict in the Middle East. But, the last one is not associated with any conflict. And this is because after about 2002, we're getting closer and closer to that global peak in conventional oil production. And we got to the kind of top of that peak, which is now referred to as the kind of bumpy plateau. And then these high oil prices led to a financial crisis of 2008. And then, as you can see there, the price of oil kind of crashes after the recession starts. And that's because businesses close, people are not consuming, they're trying to cut down, businesses are going bankrupt, and that brings oil prices down. And we should notice that we're also starting another oil crisis right now. We have an energy, oil and a coal crisis right now. Next. Okay, this shows the kind of the top of or as we approach the top of the conventional oil production peak. At the beginning there, this is before the first oil crisis, oil production was increasing by 7.8% per year. Between the two oil crises at 3.4%, and then it slows down to basically flat after the third oil crisis. Next, please. Okay, this graph shows that conventional oil, which is green there, right? So it's kind of in a plateau between about 2005 and 2019. It's called the bumpy plateau. This is the plateau of conventional oil, right? So this is peaking out and actually starting to go down now. It probably peaked around 2016, it looks like, although there's different little peaks there. And it's possible, I guess, that it could peak once again, but it's looking increasingly doubtful at this point. So the oil companies, they kind of started, once they realized themselves that the conventional oil was plateauing, they started developing these other so-called unconventional oil methods, tar sands, deep water, and shale oil. I could explain these more, but these are all unconventional oil production methods, and the difference mainly is that these things are much harder to do and much more costly. So you can do them, you can get oil out of these methods, but it costs you a lot more than conventional oil. So that changes the system considerably. Next, please. Okay, here, this graph at the top is nice because it shows you what happens at the top of the production peak. The demand, we'd like the oil production to keep going on like that red red line there, but it doesn't. The conventional oil production is starting to go down, and we can switch to unconventional, but it's a lot more expensive. And so that makes the whole thing more expensive. You have to devote more and more industrial capital to getting the same amount of oil. Next, please. Okay, now this shows the more recent oil prices. After about 2002, you can see that oil price ramps up there to its peak in 2008. And this was the historical peak, and it doesn't look like we'll ever get back to this peak. One problem with these kind of peak oil theory is that it thought that oil prices would just keep going up and up and up. But what they didn't realize is that the global economy can't really stand high oil prices. So it goes into a recession, right? And that is bad because the oil prices it's good for consumers, but it's bad for the economy because then they start going down, right? The economy basically can't handle these high oil prices, right? And we've seen this multiple times now. After the bottom of the 2008, 2009 global financial crisis and recession, the oil prices started to go up again, but they didn't get as high as they were before. And then they kind of crashed again in 2014, couldn't be supported. They tried various times, 2018 goes up again, but it really crashed in 2020 with the pandemic. It started to go up again after the initial pandemic, went up to about $80 per barrel, but now it's actually started to fall again. And that's because I think we're going into another recession now, right? The problem is that if the price of oil falls below the price of unconventional oil, which is a little less than $60 per barrel, you can't produce unconventional oil. And if you can't produce unconventional oil, well, immediately you'd have a fall in global production of oil of about 20%. So that means almost immediately in a bad recession or depression, your oil production would fall by about 20%. So that's a huge, that's more than a recession. That's a complete depression that you'd be plunged into. And that's just a few years off, right? These lines kind of converge around 2025. So by 2025, we're likely to see this happen. Next, please. Okay, can we use other sources of electricity, other things, right, to power our civilization? Well, we could have if we'd invested in these when we had a lot of fossil fuel, but we didn't, right? We didn't do that. As a global civilization, we decided not to do this. We decided just to concentrate on fossil fuels. In fact, that's what we're doing right now, right? The Philippines had about 20% of its electricity produced, or had about 38% of its electricity produced by renewables in 2003, right? So that's a while ago, 18 years ago, we had 38%, but now we have, well, in 2016, we had 24%, and it's probably much less now. So we're going in the opposite direction of where we need to go here in the Philippines, at least. Next. Okay, now we have this one other major problem. Along with high oil prices in 2008, we also had a bust of the US housing market, right? And what happened there? Well, it's kind of a Ponzi scheme, which I'll explain just in the next slide. Americans bought these big, expensive homes that they couldn't afford, right? And then after home prices peaked in 2006, and luckily I sold my parents' house right there in 2006 at the peak, because I knew this was actually coming. But after that peak, home prices collapsed about 50%. The debt could not be repaid. This busted the banks of the United States, the bank of my parents, Washington Mutual. It went bankrupt, it's gone. It led to this financial crisis, or the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. So this was a real estate bubble that was inflated by low interest rates and then crashed. Next, please. And this was a Ponzi scheme. What is a Ponzi scheme? Well, this is Ponzi right here, who invented this, I guess. Well, he didn't really invent it, but he was one of the major operators on Ponzi schemes. It's a fraudulent business investment, right? It's not really an investment. It's just a fraudulent scheme. And the specifics vary a lot, but there one variation is known as a pyramid scheme, made famous by this guy, Charles Ponzi. Basically, what you take is the early investors, you take their money, and instead of having a real investment, you take the money from the early investors and or the investors that are just starting, and you pay the early investors, right? So the inner workings, though, of course, are hidden from everybody. They're hidden from the public. They inevitably collapse when the supply of new investors slows, or something else disrupts the system. Okay, next, please. Okay, now here we can see that we've had multiple boom bust cycles, right? In the last 30 years. The most famous of which probably is the Japan bust of their real estate. And that happened in around 1990, right? And then they had 3 decades really of kind of stagnant economic growth. The stock market never got as high as it did before. So that's a good example. Ramon, I'm sure, can talk to you more about the Thailand experience, but they also had a bust, led to the Asian crisis of 1997. In US, as I've explained, in 2006, you had a peak of their housing bubble, but you also have a peak in Europe of the so-called pigs countries. And this is Portugal, Ireland, Iceland, Greece, and Spain. You had their bubble at the same time, so that was doubly bad. Shoved the world into the Great Recession, or the global financial crisis. But China is really the next one, and China's is the biggest bubble of all history, right? China, well, in this graph only goes up to 200% of GDP, but now China's debt is at 280% of GDP. So it's way, way out of the realm of all these other countries. Next, please. Okay, now, I suppose Shabuana should know something about this, but most of them don't know much about it. And I learned a lot about this just recently with this China real estate bubble. But it's interesting that real estate holds about 68% of all global wealth. China's real estate is the biggest asset, right? The whole real estate bubble in China is valued at 62 trillion. So that's a huge percent of global GDP. In fact, that dwarfs global GDP. Housing is the biggest store of wealth for the Chinese population. 60 to 80% of their wealth is stored in in these units, so-called units, but really it's for speculation. Most, or many at least, of these units are not actually livable. They're just concrete boxes. They don't have water supply. They don't have elevators. I think you have about, well, it's estimated you have about 130 million unoccupied units in China. That's about 25% of all the units, all the houses in China. And you have many of these ghost, so-called ghost cities where nobody lives in the whole city, up to 1 million units in a particular ghost city. Construction alone makes up about 30% of China's GDP. Next, please. Okay, China has a raft of problems, and one of them, its main one probably, is that its coal production, which it has used, it's its most important source of energy, peaks in 2013. And that's led to a whole series of blackouts recently, and they're massively trying to increase their imports of natural gas and coal. China's debt level as a percent of GDP is at 270%, but recently I saw that it's 280 or 90%. And I only made this slide 2 weeks ago. Evergrande is the second, this Evergrande Corporation in China is the second largest developer in China. It's actually second largest in the entire world construction company. It has the largest real estate debt in the world, in history, and it owes about $304 billion. It employs about 4 million people just itself. We also have real estate bubbles, again in the United States, also in Canada, Germany, Australia. These are ones that didn't crash in the last global financial crisis. Next, please. And then we have the starry state of the whole global economy, right? Global debt is at an all-time high of 280 trillion. So that's 335,000 per all the people in the world, or 350% of global GDP. Now the debt is much higher than in the global financial crisis. The global debt as a share of GDP is now higher than after the Great Depression and World War II. The average US household owes about more than 100,000, but only has $2,700 in the bank on average. So all of those things look bad. Next. Well, bad isn't really the correct word, I guess. It's not really bad. It's catastrophically bad. What is the economic effect of all this on the Philippines? Well, China is the largest trading partner of the Philippines, although, you know, Japan and the US also are important. What are the potential negative consequences of this unfolding economic crisis? Well, Philippines has a high level of government debt, 11.9 trillion, or that's 100,000 pesos per person. New condos have low occupancies in Cebu and other cities. It's really seen as an investment. I guess that's not surprising because it's like Cebu is like a little piece of China, right? And maybe that's the truth. It's kind of a little piece of China sitting here. Philippine real estate market may crash. Well, I definitely think it's going to crash. Philippines also has about 1/4 of all the world's biggest malls, right? So these malls, I say may here, but they definitely will go bankrupt. Foreign investments are down and they will collapse in the years to come. Filipino peso may collapse. Who knows which currencies will collapse? Maybe the U.S. currency will collapse. We don't really know in the future. Next, please. Okay, so what are the implications of all of this? Well, there's a huge number, more than I can fit in 50 slides, but here's just a few of them. The economic collapse is really more likely to reduce CO2 emissions than any kind of international agreement. Now you can see this very clearly, that this COP26 in Glasgow is just a farce. They're never going to do it, right? They're not ever going to reduce emissions because the whole global economy is dependent on fossil fuels. Peak oil and peak coal, which we're seeing just all of the indications are going to lead to a repeat of the global financial crisis, but this one's going to be a lot worse. The 2008-9 bust was about 2 or 3 years after its peak in 2006. So sometime before probably 2025, we're going to get this big bust. Before the bust, we'll experience high fuel and electricity prices, right? So it's going to go way up and then it's going to crash way down. The real estate bubbles are gonna burst worldwide, and also here in the Philippines. The Philippines debt is not ever going to be repaid. The Philippines unemployment will rise substantially as all construction stops in the Philippines. Urban poverty will increase substantially in the Philippines and worldwide. We'll have a global recession leading into a depression, and it'll completely stall any conversion to renewables and solar and wind, right? So we're not going to have a transition to a renewable economy because we had to have done that earlier. We can't do it now because now is when the crisis is hitting us. We have to convert back to agricultural existence, right? And that's what most people are going to be forced to do. Individuals now, they should reduce all of their debt. They should sell all real estate assets now, before it has crashed. Individuals, they should decrease their energy demand, right, in their residencies and businesses while they still can, right? One of the major problems is that the green revolution agriculture, which most of the world uses, although less here in the Philippines, which is good, it's dependent on fossil fuels. So that will no longer be viable and you'll have to really go organic. The good thing is that these organic technologies are much, much better than we've ever had before. We know a lot about it, but unfortunately, nobody knows this information. Only a very small fraction of people know this technology. So we need to really, fast as possible, get this organic technologies out to especially farmers, but to everybody, because most of the urbanites will have to be farmers in the future or they're going to starve. Okay, so that's basically the end of the talk. I still have a few more slides. I've gone through these first two, A and B there, energy crisis and economic crisis, but I'll just whip through these final slides just quickly, showing that there's all these other problems too. One is climate change. C, next please. We have habitat destruction. We have the sixth mass extinction. Our oceans are dying from plastic pollution, acidification. We have social media problems. We have cities that are unlivable. We have more and more unhappy urbanites. Next, please. And I think this is my last slide. We have we're all dependent on green revolution agriculture, but that's not going to be viable. So how are we going to feed these 8 billion people? We have global epidemics, which we know all about now, although they can be much worse than COVID. And we have this Cold War, which may turn into a hot war between the US and China, and they each have enough nuclear weapons, certainly, to destroy most of humanity. So those are all just added things. So that's my thesis, that we're facing collapse. So the sooner we address it, probably the better. Next. And that's the end. So thank you for listening. I realize that this is a lot to take in just an hour. Well, I've gone over my time, unfortunately.
Thank you, Dr. Glenn. Well, that is apparently a very poignant statement there. So before we go to the question and answer or the open forum, we actually have 2 reactors here on our midst. So I will introduce them and then I'll let them talk after. So I will first introduce Mr. Emmanuel P. Crucio. So our first panelist is Mr. Emmanuel P. Crucio. He is a licensed environmental and urban planner. He's currently working at the Mandaue City Planning Office as assistant department head. He has been a consultant lecturer and catalyst for planning, environmental sustainability, and resiliency for more than 2 decades now. And he hopes to contribute in raising the level of public service and governance to a more humane, practical, and community-centered undertaking. And I will also introduce our second panelist, is Mr. Dan Diaz. He is a climate justice activist and international speaker on leadership, sustainability, and green business. His passion for people and the planet brought him to help and mobilize eco actions in Cebu Island and indigenous communities. His training, experience, and global involvement in social enterprise and sustainable development made a mark because of his dedicated commitment to sharing this with the grassroots communities. He is the founder and executive director of Sustainable Energy and Enterprise Development for Communities, SEED for COM for short, that empowers communities and change lives through the promotion of renewable energy for all in off-grid, last-mile, and disaster risk communities, environmental conservation, education, and entrepreneurship. He is also the co-founder of Pusyon Kinaiyahan International, or Alliance of the Earth. It's a grassroots movement for the protection of people and the planet. He's currently the Secretary General of the Philippine Marine Environmental Protection Association, country coordinator of Philippine Waste Platform, former foundation for the Philippine Environment Visayas Regional Advisory Committee, former SK counselor and co-founder of the Student in Action for Values and Environment, or SAVE, a political student organization in Cebu. He is also involved in many environmental campaigns and organizations, notably with former US Vice President Al Gore's Climate Reality Project, national convener and prime mover of Let's Do It Philippines movement, National Cleanup Day Coalition, EcoBricks Philippines, Zero Waste Academy Philippines, and just recently, the Food Gardens movement to promote food security for COVID-19 response. He's a Jamsetji Tata National Virtual Academy for Rural Prosperity Fellowship in India, recipient of the Miguel R. Magalang Individual Climate Leadership Memorial Award, ASEAN Leadership Fellow on Smart Cities, featured as Amazing Earth Hero, G Diaries World Changer, and past president of the Rotary Club of Mandaue North. And also as a citizen of the world, he gives back and volunteers his time and resources to promote friendship, prosperity, and peace. A World Youth Day volunteer international development worker has led them to travel on 43 countries. So I will let Mr. Crucial go first. So
Hi, thank
take it
you,
away.
BJ. I don't know if my video is on, but it doesn't matter.
It's not yet, but
Yeah,
go ahead, sir.
I don't know. I'll just anyway. Thank you for paglaom sa Cebu PSS for inviting me as one of the panelists. Madungan na ba ko? Okay ra?
Yep, loud and clear.
Yeah, and thank you also Dr. Glenn Green for the, I should say, very comprehensive and elaborate discussion on civilizations and economy. So I prepared something on the discussion, especially on the climate change. For me, climate change is basically a discussion on production. No? Basically, it's the means of production, and in my mind right now, I have two systems, no, economic systems, whether it's socialist or socialism or capitalism. That's basically the it's like a yin yang of economy, and the discussion of Dr. Green is an important, I should say, concept on mega trends, because mega trends right now, it's an important shift, no, in the progress of a society or any other particular field or activity. So, for example, we're talking here of shifting the economic power, the change of our climate, and then even the resource scarcity. And that's just some examples of mega trends. Any major movement in society or any field, that's where Dr. Green's discussion focused on. Climate change for me, if we are to understand, no, climate change, we need to dig deeper into the science of it. So if we have more scientists that claim this climate change is real or is not real, and then we have to see also what are the indicators of climate change, and then the impacts at the local condition, at the local level, and what the future will bring us amidst this trend. So climate change is, I have a mentor when I was studying in United Nations University in Tokyo, Mr. Glantz, Dr. Glantz. Climate change is actually what he called is a CEP, creeping environmental problem. So this concept, creeping environmental problems, being used, to measure the level of impacts, the degree of how it affects society. And then we also have from the United Nations framework for climate change, they also use this one, SOEs, this slow onset events. Okay, when you say slow onset events, it's basically almost the same as CEP. It refers to the risks and impacts which are associated with increasing temperature. We all know that desertification, for example, in the Aral Sea in Russia, and then loss of biodiversity, as what Dr. Glynn mentioned, and then land and forest degradation, the glacial retreat, ocean acidification, sea level rise, salinization, saltwater intrusion in our case. And then, so since the previous decades, there were modeling or experiments or predictions on the climate on our society. So, for example, in the 1970s, there were actually dread factors or some kind of a scare strategy, like it was used not to prompt political and societal action, what to do amidst this condition. So a good example of that is now what we call the global warming, as what Mr. Glenn said. Now, going back to CEP or creeping environmental problem as, because when you talk about creeping environmental problem, it's not abrupt, but it's already happening now, and then we don't know, as what Dr. Glenn said, if the collapse will happen biologically, economically. One author, Jamison, in 1994 said, there are reasons for the delay of societal responses to this CEP, for example, to this environmental problem. He noted that, number one, the audience for CEP of creeping environmental problem, or the SOEs, is, the audience is diverse. When you say diverse, we have same message, but we mean different things to different people. So like interpretation, for example. Number two, many people are not scientifically equipped, and that is true. In the Philippines, when you see the social media, you can actually see people are now beginning to become social scientists, political analysts, sports analysts, etc., etc. They become many personality. They have many personalities because of the conditions that we are facing. Significant creeping environmental problem is a long term, actually, and it is not a near term, where most people, especially policymakers, are not used to thinking long term. Of course, no, because policymakers, political leaders, they think of the short term, 3-year term, actually. Number four, the many of the creeping environmental problem, if affects on human welfare, will be relatively invisible, which means people have difficulty linking the indirect impacts to an initial cause. So, and that goes to the number 5, which is the beginning of a creeping environmental problem is gradual and uncertain. It can never be predicted. No, it's rather than dramatic and obvious. So it's gradual and uncertain. So, as an example of SOEs, or slow onset events, for Mandawi, I'm actually talking now in the local condition. So, for example, we discuss in the Mandawi situation where how do we address water supply? Because in Mandawi, we only have 35% water supplied by MCWD, Metro Cebu Water District. There is this joke in our office that MCWD does not mean Metro Cebu Water District. For the Visayans, it means Muagas Kadyot Wa Dayon. So meaning we only have very little water. And then that's why Mandawi is already looking at this SOE for how to deal with it. And then the other thing is the supply chain management. Since we know that Mandawi is a hub for high value products, so what if, for example, this pandemic or another pandemic or epidemic will struck the province or the metropolitan Cebu? What will happen to our economy in Mandawi, since it is a hub for high value products assembled there? Where will we get our raw materials, for example? So that is my discussion, my take on the discussion of Dr. Green on the climate change. Now, I would go back to the means of production, because since socialism and capitalism are very, they're very different in terms of the nature of their operation. Common humanity socialism, for example, they believe that, the believers of common humanity socialism, that people have a natural relationship that should be based on cooperation. So meaning, we are brothers and sisters, we love each other, we are friends, etc., etc. And then we work collectively to achieve mutual benefits. But on the other hand, capitalism is competition, and it leads to conflict actually. And people ignore their natural relationships with others. So my question is, will socialism as a means of economic system better system to address common environmental problem or slow onset events of the climate change related events better than the capitalist system? So that's my question. And in terms of collapse, in terms of societal response to the challenge, the pandemic actually helped the world, in terms of emission, carbon emission on a longer term, because the very few months after the onset of the pandemic, we saw the earth is clearer now. But if that's the, how do you call this, that's the solution for that, for the problem, what will be our future? That's my question. But looking at the discussion of Dr. Green in the last slide, I think second to the last slide, when he mentioned about go organic, it's actually going back to the basics. And then the Philippines actually has, I can mention about 2 sustainable systems experiences. No, we have the Masipag Way. Actually, it's the farmers movement that promotes sustainable agriculture, and it involves 2 processes. First, the use of diverse traditional seed varieties, organic fertilizers, and soil conditioners. Number 2, integrated pest management that avoids chemicals. Oh, there's number 3 also, complementation and integration of crop and livestock production. So meaning it do away with chemicals. Now, the second system is the Muyong system. It is found in the northern Luzon. No? It is an illustration of managed landscape diversity. So it is practiced by the Ifugaos. And in the Muyong, MUYONG, it means forest communally owned by a clan, is considered an extension of the payo or the rice field. And it is located in the upper portion of the lot. So meaning to say, when you have when they have this farming lot or farm lot, and this rice field is located on the upper portion of the lot, so it serves as the habitat for various organisms, and it helps conserve water for the rice fields. So it's actually happening. So generally, I would a little, in a way, disagree with the collapse thing if we can do this on the local level. So I think that's all for my input on the discussion of Dr. Green, and I really appreciative of the kind of massive how do you call this, discussion on the global trends, going back to the basic levels or phases of our civilization, which is the hunting, gathering stage, and up to now, when we have the high technology, the low the technology, and then we also have the digital divide, because when we have these 6 billion people on earth, how many are or can access actually the discussion online right now? So there's this divide, there's this not only economically but also technologically. So I'm very thankful for this, and thank you very much for the invitation. Salamat, Dr. Ramon and Ma'am Marisa.
Thank you, Mr. Crucia. That's a very comprehensive mention of your experience in Mandaue and all over the Philippines also, and that's a very positive but conditional take on Mr. Green's thesis. Next up, let's go to Mr. Diaz. Mr. Diaz?
Yes, thank you very much, BJ. Thank you very much, Paglaom sa Cebu, and most especially to our scientist, Glenn Green. Actually, I'm so much optimistic that together with Paglaom sa Cebu, we can be prepared of this global crisis, this red alert of the planet because of the presentation made by Dr. Glenn of the extensive study and data. So what is it for us Filipinos or in the grassroots? First and foremost, we have to develop passion for research. We have to develop scientists in all areas because they will be the one who will, alert us. For example, what had happened to COVID pandemic? If there is no internet, if there is no social media, we will not know where it comes from, right? And because of that, the internet for me is a digital equalizer. But the problem is not all can access because not all are provided with the energy, provided with the fossil fuel is limited. So the idea here in last mile off-grid, we have to focus on the non-renewable energy where Seed4Com has been active in the height of the Typhoon Yolanda. Our programs are geared towards disaster energy response all over Visayas. It was noted that we are so addicted to oil. We already know that we have 50% oil in our planet, but we still keep on relying on oil. There's so much studies, there's so much options like the sun. Imagine the sun is like money coming down to your rooftop. The water, the water from the oceans can be used as renewables. The wind can be a source of energy. In fact, my friend from Japan, he messaged me 4 years ago, and they already implemented the Chal energy in Bataan, where they started pioneer because the wind energy, the idea here is if there's storm, they shut off the wind farms. So here, when there's storm, they continue to operate and produces energy even without the storm. And now there's one in Bataan. It's already completed, a Japanese friend of mine. And there should be, we already talk about COP21. It was agreed like there should be financial investments to develop and provide, this what we call climate justice. What is climate justice? Countries that produce a lot of greenhouse that are dependent on coal has to pay back to vulnerable countries to demand climate justice from these countries or companies. So that is very important. So shifting away from oil dependency to renewable, we have to do it now. And good that banks are already divesting from fossil fuel based. There are still banks that provide funding, but we need a civil society. We need our voices together. So second about the energy is like the transition. And then people, it talks about capacity. Remember, there's a capacity in each island. There's a capacity in each home. There's a capacity in each planet, and we have to educate. You've been to many islands. I've been to many islands. I said, "Ngano man, why is this like in an island of fisher folks, no income, but they have 5 to 10 kids, And in the urban cities, they are professionals, but they don't have kids. They only have 1 or 2, right? Analysis is, it provide homes to people, whether they borrowed that money, you provide jobs, they become more busy. Once they become more busy, then they can think higher. Because, our next project, we go to island in Hilutungan because we provide pangal, we provide fish cage to different fisher folks during the pandemic, because we don't want them to starve because they have been providing us food many times, our farmers and fisher folks. And the slow food movement, when I was in Germany in 2007, is already there to produce your own food, do organic, natural, or permaculture. And Australia is one of the best example of permaculture because they were prisoners from UK, they sent to Australia, and there's no land, and they think, and then they come up with organic to sustain themselves. So we have to shift from the me to we, from the mindset of countries of growing their economic growth. And good thing it was mentioned by Dr. Green, 1975. 3 hours, and I was born in 1975. So I had a mission, maybe Dr. Green, to make sure that we use non-renewables. I mean, we shift to non-renewables. We always talk about 3 R's in environment, and reduce growth. But instead of reduce growth, we have to, manage growth. Look at Cebu, for example, as an example of China. Cebu is China because people, the businessmen, came from China, and that's why we don't have Chinatown, because the entire Cebu or businessmen are Chinese. And we already have a street called Xiamen near SM. And I know the next topic is reclamation. And I came from that place, reclamation. Because of reclamation, because I also squatter, I moved to Polpogan, Consolacion, and it was not developed. Then I went to Lorega, San Miguel. And we have to distribute progress. People migrate to urban cities. They left the farming. So we have to limit this growth in urban cities. I always talk about that many times. Pirmi mag-develop ang Cebu City, can we develop other areas? Can we provide internet access? Can we provide energy? Because that's very good enabler. Can we provide water? And desalination should the way to go, because we are surrounded with water, and these technologies are already there, but with politics, with corruption, prices, capital increases, wala pa ganing project, daghan na sila gipangayo, no? And sad to say, dili madayon because the election comes now, no? So with the carbon, I always say, like, this carbon privatization, it's the same story of the Ludo campaign that we initiated to stop with the Pusyon Kinaiyahan, and with the election, true enough, the electorates change their stand on Ludo. So I'm optimistic that the JV with carbon will also follow. And then the other thing is population. I already mentioned. And aside from energy, if we keep on using plastics, if we don't manage our waste, then it's still an addiction to coal. And we don't have to look at the climate crisis. We have to look at biodiversity loss. So it's already indicated that there are loss of species. Are we humans not part of the species of the biology? So climate change is just one. The bigger is biodiversity loss. And if we don't take care of our land, air, water, we all be extinct. So this crisis is a crisis of opportunity. This session right now is very informative, and we have to spread this and translate it to grassroots who haven't reached to the internet. So thank you, Dr. Glenn. Looking forward to 2025. We're still awaiting what will happen, but we don't just want to stand not doing anything. Stop the talking, start acting together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Diaz. That's a more positive spin on the topic, actually, and we really admire your call to action for everyone. Before we go to the Q&A, Dr. Green might want to react to the reactors. So I'll let Dr. Green for a few words.
Yeah, well, I appreciate both Sir Crucio and Sir Diaz. I appreciate both of them. Really, both of them point out what we need to do here on the ground, right? I mean, I think we're caught in this big global problem, which we really can't do anything about that. It's just going to come down on our heads. But what we can do is what they've started to talk about here is we can start preparing for this eventuality, right? We have to prepare, and we have to especially integrate the rural Filipinos, you know, because they're going to be the ones that we're going to be depending on, right? Our agricultural policy here is just terrible, right? The farmers are not getting a fair share, right? And the corporations just want to screw them out of their production. So we have to give them a much better share, and because we're gonna, that is the model. We have to come up with a model that's not dependent on the global economy, right? Not dependent on construction jobs, right? Not dependent on loans coming from the West. It's going to be dependent on the soil. It's going to be dependent on the rain. It's going to be dependent on the trees that we plant, right? And that's got to be the way we have to focus all our efforts now, because in doing this lecture, really, I became convinced there's just nothing we can do to stop this from happening. We have to start preparing for it, right? We have to, all our actions have to be such that we're moving toward this other way of existence and abandon this failing model that we have now of urban existence, and trying to keep that going, because that's not going to work out. So I really appreciate both the speakers and what they had to say, but we need really many more discussions about this. Next.
Thank you, Dr. Green, for that. So right now, we're opening the forum. So everyone on the audience can participate and ask questions to Dr. Green, or even for Mr. Diaz and Mr. Crucio. Though we'll ask pretty much everyone here on the, how many are we? 12 people minus 4 of us. So for the 8 people here on the Zoom call. So though I might start with Dr. Ramon Sevilla here. So Dr. Sevilla, any thoughts about the talk so far?
You have to unmute, Ramon.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, hello. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Loud and clear.
As I mentioned in my introduction, my welcome, that we have to bring this down to the local level. And it's very difficult because, this requires change of mindsets. In the recent bakuna, the vaccination campaign, Glenn was talking about reduction of emissions, the energy crisis. Pero in the bakuna campaign, the first prize given by the city is a car. I asked this in Paglaom sa Sugbo, ngano dili man, why not give a good quality bicycle? So that people will have alternatives instead of riding, or give them a 2 years, 3 years pass, free pass, a beep. This sort of things will help convince people that there is another way, or invest in pedestrian sidewalks. Pero, you give them a car as first prize. What is the message there? Wa gani parking, no parking available. Dakpon na mo sitom. Thank you.
Okay, so that was Dr. Ramon. Anyone? Yeah. So Dr. Green, go ahead.
What's that?
Can I say something? Sorry.
Go ahead, Dr. Crucio. I'm Mr. Crucio.
I think it goes back to the economic system that we have right now. When you have a car for prize for everyone, or for anyone who has achieved, for example, sa bakuna, then it goes to show that the as Dr. Ramon said, the mindset has not changed even a bit, even if we already noted the seemingly the cleanup of the atmosphere when we started when the pandemic started. I really appreciated it when I saw the pictures from Metro Manila, and then looking at the Metro Manila from Antipolo, and then the skies were clear. So diha palang daan makita na to sa politiko or for any leader nga, wow, if we have this, the stoppage of the I have my car, no, but when you have to really go down to the discussion on how much fuel, how much emission that we have done in the last 2 years, 3 years. So para nako, it should have abot ito sa level sa policy, but lahi man gud kay pandani man gud sa boto na votes. That's the bottom line is votes. Salamat.
Thank you, Mr. Crucio. Anyone else from the...
I'll add also. Yeah, I'll add also now. So
No.
I don't know if the mandate of NEDA is one that we can anchor, because politics are short term. There should be a creation, for example, of how about New York, New York has still been investing, planning on their subways, whoever is the mayor, they have to, continue the mobility, look at Singapore when we study it. So there should be a group that has to be created and mandated by the government, not anymore regional, not anymore citywide, but national, like Bhutan. Bhutan, the country, indicates that you can only develop this type of land. You have to protect, 30% to be forest, right? So they have the most happy index all over the world. And these global learnings has to be implemented in the Philippines. So mao gihapon ang transportation. Actually, mayroon sila transportation, we have to go mass transport. In the Philippines, we have jeep, we have buses. So I don't have a car, I don't have a driver's license. So I'm here in Iloilo, and Iloilo City has been adjudged as one of the mobility of in fact, in the streets, there's already bike lanes here. They put plants on the street when I woke up. So Iloilo, the Philippines has a good model. Agriculture, we already have, but let's learn from the indigenous natural-based solutions. Don't think about of creating a technology that you can fly to the moon or whatever. You spend so much money, but the real score here is education, grassroots awareness, and these wisdoms are already here and learnings. So let's go back to that spirit of not the me per region, but the we thing, that we are all together in this as a community, a bayanihan. So that's our culture as a Filipino, working together. That's for me are critical. No, in the development, there should be a group that and I hope Paglaom sa Cebu will always be there. But now it is a challenge in 2022 to have action. Because they always say, sige lang magsulti diha when we action. So, but we members are doing action, we don't have funding, right? Because, honestly, I'm shared it to one of my fellow who's attending, si Agustos, in every proposals in the city, whether it's environmental, how come that the civil society will have more time, will exert more money to contest the coal plant, to contest the JB, and Who will be our lawyer? Who will fund our say no? And this big capital joint venture has so much money, and to us, so we have to a lot of time and resources and people na ex deal na to, and what's in it for us? Wala. It's for the next generation, the common good and the progress that we want to achieve. No, so that one is my take.
Thank you for the takes. Anyone else from the audience who wants to give their reactions or questions to to Dr. Green, Mr. Diaz, and Mr. Crucio?
You're muted, DJ.
Okay, so Mr. Carlito Banate,
Hello.
go ahead.
Wala.
Mr. Banate?
I think I'll go first.
I'll
Yeah, hello. Hello.
Ah, okay, there we go.
wait. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Banate.
So I have a reaction on the presentation of Dr. Glenn Green, which is very informative, and I learned. Thank you, Dr. Glenn Green. And based on the presentation, I was scared because of what I can predict also, that there is a crisis on our electricity, and that will affect our industry. So the question here, how can we be prepared? We have a lot of untapped energy resources, but the question here is how much is the cost per kilowatt hour to produce, and who will fund the project? So we have politics. That is one problem. Okay, so as a member of the Philippine Society of Mechanical Engineers, the government now has a plan to eliminate coal power plants by 2030. So do we have renewable energy resources ready to fill up the gap? So this is very critical. Who will invest on this transition of supplying energy to the people and our economy, industry? So the plan of the government, as we have discussed in our convention last week, that the government has a short-term plan, a roadmap for the transition. We have this energy efficiency means to reduce losses, So first is to have a plant, combined cycle or cogeneration plant to have more efficiency, and then we have to shift to the cleanest fossil fuel, which is the natural gas. This is now the target, and we will have then an energy storage, and then we go develop more on biomass and biogas, and then solar power. So the second is the medium term. In the next 5 years or more, this is the medium term, we will have more on develop solar farm, wind energy, geothermal power plant, hydropower plant, and open cycle and combined cycle power plants. Then we have to have support that how to transport this liquefied natural gas. So we need to have that. And then the long term, for the next 10 years, we will go on hydrogen fuel. We will also tap on the tidal wave, ocean, the waves, the ocean energy. And the last one is I think that's the last one which people doesn't understand yet, nuclear energy. Because right now, I think since 1995, when I was in Japan, I was a nuclear inspector of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. As of now, I am currently commissioned in the US for nuclear inspection. So there were only development. They are developing in Toshiba these small reactors for power plant, not the big one. So the investment is not too big, and we can have to get rid of the CO2, but there shall be more education on how safe is the nuclear power plant. For me, the nuclear power plant problem is only the waste fuel, how to dispose that waste fuel. Okay, and that's all that's all my thoughts about that. We need action. We need to have action. We have so many plans. We have bright ideas, but we need how to move ahead. That's a problem. Financing and decision makers, politics. So we need to push. And without any action, we will be in crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Banate. Well, it's more of a reaction anyway. I think the next one would be Ms. Cantonao. Ms. Cantonao. Maria, you there? Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Green, for your presentation. I think that knowing the Cebuano culture and the way the people think, the presentation that you gave is very alarmist, but doesn't mean that it's not true. But people will probably reject it because they don't want to believe that it's true. But what can we do? That's where we're heading. And I agree with what you say. Because when we say progress, we only think about the economic aspect. We don't really think about people and the environment. So they think that, for example, the Philippine Reclamation Authority is so proud that there are 14 ongoing reclamation projects in the country. Why would you be proud of destroying, of destroying the habitat underwater? That is just bonkers. You shouldn't even be saying that in public. And because then you are displacing people, you are taking thousands of livelihoods, you are killing the marine that's already there for for a long time. There is really a disconnect between when people say they care for the environment versus to what they do, especially with the politicians. We are also very immature voters. We keep on voting the same anti-environment, anti-people politicians over and over and over. I believe that we need to understand what is intergenerational, or the principle of intergenerational responsibility. This is the concept that what we do now regarding the protection of the environment shouldn't be for our own children, for our grandchildren. It should be for the generations to come. Because when we think about it that way, we are not so short-sighted. We think bigger. We think bigger picture. So yeah. And also, just one last thing, Sir Crucio, you said that the pandemic has benefited the environment, but a lot of studies are showing that it didn't. So maybe for the first few months, the emissions were lower, but in the next months thereafter, it suddenly increased, and it even rose more than the previous years. So there are good and bad, but probably more bad than good.
When I said that, Mara, that's the first few months, but after that, wala na. So, katubang total lockdown, moto ako sabot.
Yeah, so that the emission savings that we've had was obliterated right away when the economy opened up again.
Thanks, Mara, for the reaction. Next would be Mr. Gus would want to speak. Mr. Gus,
Hello,
Gus,
hello. Good morning,
go ahead.
PSS. Just a quick reaction as I've heard from the presentation. Real estate is composed of 68%, but the IBSC claims that 75% of the world's wealth are now in real estate. No? And those data, I'm just wondering what the capitalists or where the capitalists are heading now, since this is the trend. No? They are investing more in real estate. However, on the other side, we have so many in the population who are homeless. No, we have housing backlog here in our country. I think we are now in 7.2 million housing backlog. This is in contrast to the data that we are in real estate has the 75% of the world's wealth. Okay, and then second point, the general crisis, even though now we already have experienced previous crises, but as what we know, it will only fall if there is a strong resistance, no? Or there are division of the capitalist countries, such what happened on World War I, World War II, and there is a strong people's resistance. So ang point lang, the capitalist system can do whatever they want to survive, no? However, if the people's movement cannot cope up to fight, we can maneuver, no, to strengthen, prolong the crisis, or bring the crisis to the oppressed people. So what should we do? I suggest that we have to win or go to the people, to the oppressed, labi na mga professionals, to go alongside with them so that the crisis dili maipasa sa ato, no? Dili maipasa sa mga kabus, but to change, no? To have system change or whatever change that will benefit all the people, not only those who are in power. So siguro lesson learned with what Professor Green discussed today. So we have to go immersed with the people, no, to the struggling people, to effect and change in this society. No, that is the challenge to us. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Augusto. Think if Professor Cynthia here wants to comment. I think she's the last one who hasn't given her thoughts. I don't want to give my thoughts. I'm just the moderator. That's not my job. Professor Cynthia, you there? Okay, she's there.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm the wife of Dr. Green. So I have been supporting him in his advocacy in discussing about this triple crisis ever since a long time ago. So kanang Bimbo Fernandez had invited him in Pagtambaya yung years ago, when 12 years ago or 8 years ago, no? He had been a constant supporter of a resource person for Bimbo in educating the masses, no? The groups, different groups he had organized to listen and to talk about this climate change and its impact on the people, no? So I really we need really to work together in educating the people, even the ordinary people, no, the masses. So I'm struck with what Mara said about reaching out to people, no, those who are short-sighted, those who are less informed about climate change, and then we have to think bigger, no, because we have to. At one point, I was asking Glenn, no nga, why do we have the moral obligation to do this? And then he explained to me very simply by saying that the Filipinos will suffer the most impact, knowing of it's a tropical country, and then it's the geographical condition, no, of our kanang country, because we will be the most affected. Even we have less emissions, but the impact will have more of that, no, like bigger typhoons. There will be bigger typhoon, no, not stronger typhoons, but no, again, excuse me, it doesn't mean that we will have more typhoons, but the typhoons will be stronger. So we will experience more impact in terms of the environment. So people will be affected with the flooding, with all these other things. So when it comes to the resources, all the resources will be wasted because we will just be doing mitigation or short-term responses or reactions to calamities as a result of the impacts or the bigger impacts of climate change. So that's why we really have to educate more, no, immerse with the people. And then as I really appreciate what Bimbo had done years ago when he was very passionate about organizing, explaining to people, educating the different sectors that he had organized, not to educate them the importance or the impact of climate change. So that's it. So I am, so in order for us to translate it to the masses, because I was so busy at that time, no, I was also teaching or a guidance counselor. So in some of his talks, when I am available, I tried to explain some in Visaya. No, I talked with him. I experienced that when he was invited by Rotary in Dulhu, Fatima, that we were both, no, so what he is talking about and discussing about these things, I was also translating at the same time, so the people, the listeners or the audience can understand more. So that was a really very kanang happy experience for me to be able to assist him, because he's American, no? He talks technical terms, no? And then, but most of us, even me, as even I'm a professional, so sometimes I cannot understand some of those terms. So that's why he cannot do it for us, but I can help Glenn. I can help him. I do try to help him when I'm around or I'm with him. That's why I always go with him to support him in his advocacy. So I can translate them to the simplest way that people can understand, the people that we are trying to educate, the people that we are trying to reach out. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Miss Cynthia, for supporting your husband. But yeah, that's a very noble goal that we have. And I guess for everyone here, I think Dr. Green's Dr. Green's statements should push us as a group, as Paglaong sa Sugbo and as citizens to push into action for our survival. Let's have, okay, Dr. Green, any last?
Well, I appreciate Cynthia's comments. And one, one thing I'd like to say finally is that I have this vision of a place to, educate Cebuanos, like a kind of a, maybe like a museum. I have a lot of books and a lot of things that are kind of museum quality. And that would be one way to educate people, to have like a natural history museum talking about these things, but have it in English, but also in Cebuano, and have a place where people can learn about these things, in their native dialect, and we can invite groups. And so I'm going to talk about this to Bimbo, and God willing, he'll be elected vice mayor in Cebu.
Okay, Miss Marisa, I think it's up for the closing. And after this, please don't leave. We'll have like a photo op before we go or we chat more. Miss Marisa? You're muted. Okay.
I'd like to thank everyone for being around to discuss this topic with Dr. Green. Dr. Green wants us to prepare for the worst because it is, he says, inevitable. But there are always two sides to it, I see. When you say humanity faces collapse, you're actually, I would like to underscore humanity. And if the problem is global, the first approach should be for the government, if it's global, then for all governments to work together so that there is a unified action on the problem. If it is a local, it's a major problem for the Philippines, then it is the local leadership, the government that should be focused and define the policies. So it's actually going to be a work of all branches of government, legislative, and especially the executive branch, focused. The other side of that problem is the human aspect, which is the government provides the environment for movement, for the solution to take place, but the solution actually is provided by the human, the people. So I agree with the reactions that said that we should be able to, the individuals must be able to see themselves as part of the solution. It means that there was a suggestion to go back to basic, that we should harness the local talents that we have. There has to be involvement of the people in the solution. Yes, education is very much a part of it, and reaching out to them, because a person can only act if a person understands and believes in what he is supposed to do. And I'd like to think of the solution as this broom. Somebody has to put the broom together, and who composes the broom? It's all the different kanang sticks, all the different pieces. Yeah, you put them all together, and that becomes the broom that's going to, but there has to be somebody who will unite all of these efforts. And that to me is the two-pronged solution Dili pwedeng government lang or external lang ang solutions. It's got to siphon down to the people so that they get involved. And I think that's very important. It's not going to be a top-down, no? Top macro level, but the micro has also to be addressed. So that is my take on the talk of Dr. Green. And we do this in Paglaom sa Cebu. We hold talk series every now and then to talk about important issues because that is the very essence of the group. We talk about understanding the bigger problem by discussing it in fora like this one, so that we will be able to rally and influence the development of solutions to our urban development issues. So that's thank you very much, and I hope that you will all be involved in the next talk series.
Thank you, Miss Marisa. Again, please don't forget to like our Facebook page, Paglaom sa Cebu, if you haven't. Most likely you have. And also our Facebook group where Dr. Mon would post his daily rants. Anyway, before we go, let's take a group photo. Please turn on your cameras. Mr. Gus, can you open your camera? Okay, he can. All right, okay. So please smile at the camera. 1, 2, 3.
This is the Magnificent 9. we reached 19, I think, earlier.
That's nice, actually. We have lots of participants. Okay. I'm gonna post this on what's this? I'm gonna post it on the event page, if that's okay.
Yeah, we'd like to thank Dr. Green, Noel, Crucio, and Dan Yes for your participation. Thank you. See you.
That
Bye-bye.
ends our session. I guess it's a goodbye unless you want to stay on. I don't think they're gonna stay on. Go ahead. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a pleasant day.